welcome everybody to our one of our events within the Strathclyde Sustainability Month, hosted by the Centre for Sustainable Development. So I'm the Operations Manager at the Centre for Sustainable Development. So you're all very welcome to this webinar. And we've got lots of events that are happening. I'll post the link in the chat later on if there's anything else anybody would like to look into. And I'm just going to pass over to Professor James Curran.
Hi everybody, and thanks very much, Fiona, and a particular thanks to the Centre for Sustainable Development for running this really interesting and diverse programme throughout this month. This afternoon, I think it's going to be a great event. We're going to be concentrating on biodiversity. Now, everyone will know, I'm sure, about COP26 that was hosted here in Glasgow last November, which is all about climate change. But fewer, I think, but probably all of you do, but fewer generally will know so much about COP15, which kicks off in China next month, which is all about biodiversity and nature. We are in a nature and climate emergency after all. So these two COPs, 26 and now imminent COP15, are vitally important to the health of the planet. I'm not going to trample over what Deborah, I know our speaker, will be saying, but I just want to quote a couple of, to me anyway, quite shocking statistics. 70% of people in the UK think there'll be less variety of life or biodiversity over the next 50 years. But in Scotland, only 28% of people are very concerned about loss of biodiversity, and only 19% of people think biodiversity is very relevant to them personally. Now that bothers me because even the World Trade Organization has issued the now widely quoted figure that 55% of the global GDP depends on functioning ecosystems. So boy, does it matter to all of us personally. So I think it's really timely that we have Deborah Long with us to speak about COP, and I'm sure many other associated issues this afternoon. You have her brief biography, but she heads up Scottish Environment Link, and she's had a career in academia, particularly in citizen science, where I got to know Deborah very well, and she's worked right across the NGO sector as well. Link is interesting. It's the umbrella body for, I think, 40, is it now, environmental NGOs in Scotland, and they span from bugs, butterflies and bumblebees right through to whales, wildlife and woodlands. So an exciting and interesting membership that Deborah represents. So I'm going to pass straight across to Deborah to speak to us mainly about COP15. Over to you, Deborah.
Great, thank you very much, James. And it's great to be here with you all, and it's great to have an hour to talk about nature, to be honest. I don't often get that long to talk about nature, so I'm really looking forward to this. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my slides, and I hope that you can now see that.
Yes, we can see it.
Brilliant. Okay, great. I just need to get my my slides up. So James has given you an introduction to me and who I am. I'm Chief Officer at Scottish Environment Link, and these are some of our members. We have 44 member organisations, and this is a network of environmental charities who work in Scotland, and it goes from the big to the small, and James has given you some examples of those. The other thing that I would say about our members is that they work on a huge range of topics. So some work on species conservation, some work on active travel, marine issues, planning issues. So they cover the whole range of anything and everything that could impact and does impact on the environment. Between them, they have more than 500,000 people supporting them. And the reason we come together is because we want to be, or we try to be, the voice for Scotland's environment, particularly in policy circles, and you will see that as I talk, I think. But we're all working together towards our objectives of a sustainable Scotland, where our environment is restored, resilient and connected, and where our society and well-being have nature at their heart, benefiting people, communities, and the planet. So that's what we're about. I'm just going to start with a little bit of context, just to remind you all, we're all living on planet Earth, of course, looks like the blue marble from space, but Scotland is, of course, a tiny speck. You can't even see Scotland on that map, it's beneath the cloud. But despite that, Scotland has a role much, much larger than its geography implies. In the 1700s, Scotland was at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution, when today's relentless rise in carbon dioxide levels began. Then in the 1950s, the UK began a drive to become self-sufficient in food we could produce here. And that was marked by the start of mechanized farming and large-scale production methods, and the acceleration in biodiversity loss that's reached the crisis point that we're talking about today. And having played significant roles in both crises, one globally and one at home, it's only right that we're at the forefront of tackling both of them. So that's what I want to, that's the kind of context that I just wanted to remind us all of. And I think here in Scotland, it would be fair to say that we've recognised that we've got this role that goes way beyond our geographic size. There's recognition at the highest level of government that both climate change and nature loss are existential crises for Scotland. And you can see on this slide here a quote from a letter to us from the First Minister, written in 2019, when we asked her specifically about her priorities for nature and climate. And you can see what she says there. So we are seeing political commitment and progress towards the 2045 target on climate change in Scotland. There are a few bumps in the road, but we are seeing some progress. And we're looking to see the same level of commitment now to nature loss. We need that if we're going to make progress on both of the crises, both the nature crisis and the climate crisis. So just a little bit of background. Today we're facing, well, I've identified 3 major challenges there, and they're all rooted in how we interact with the natural world. And these challenges are changing the world. COVID-19 brought human disease on a scale that we've not seen since 1918 and the Spanish flu. And then, of course, we're in the climate emergency, with global temperatures rising at unprecedented rates and severely impacting on communities and natural habitats on land and at sea. And at the same time, we're in a nature emergency, where the rate of species extinction is rising exponentially, characterizing the new geological period, now called the Anthropocene, where global changes are for the first time being caused by human activity. And while we can't solve all 3 emergencies at once, one thing we mustn't do is solve one while making the other 2 worse. I'm not going to say very much about the climate emergency. COP26 in November in Glasgow last year aired all of the issues, the challenges and the opportunities, both around the climate crisis and our response to it at home and globally. The Scottish Government is beginning to make the links between climate and nature, not so much between nature and disease yet, but that will come hopefully. And you can see from this quote from the Environment Minister, Rosanna Cunningham, in 2019, acknowledging and recognising Scotland's role in tackling both of them. So just to repeat myself a little bit, what we're looking for now is the same commitment and clarity that we've seen for the climate crisis to now be applied to the nature crisis. So the nature crisis. The loss of species was reported in the IPBES. IPBES is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. They published a global assessment in 2019, which showed that 1 million species across the world are threatened by extinction. And this is being driven by 5 direct drivers of change, which, if we look at them in descending order, are, so most important first, changes in land and sea use. Then we have direct exploitation of organisms. Then we have climate change. Then we have pollution, and then we have invasive non-native species. What you've got on this slide is a summary of the report findings. I was just going to supplement this with a few statistics that are also occur in the report, and you've got the link there on the slide if you want to look it up. So for example, 3/4 of the land-based environment and about 2/3 of the marine environment have been significantly altered by human actions. More than 1/3 of the world's land surface and nearly 75% of freshwater resources are now devoted to crop or livestock production. Land degradation has reduced the productivity of 23% of the global land surface. And in 20 2015, 33% of marine fish stocks were being harvested at unsustainable levels. Urban areas have more than doubled since 1992, and plastic pollution has increased tenfold since 1980. There's lots of stats in the report. I won't give you any more, but one thing that the report does highlight is that in all of the policy scenarios that it explores, negative trends in nature will continue to 2050, except for those that include transformative change. You can see the quote here from IPBES Chair, Sir Robert Watson. He continues beyond the end of this quote to say, the report also tells us that it is not too late to make a difference, but only if we start now at every level, from local to global. Through transformative change, nature can still be conserved, restored, and used sustainably. And that's what I want to explore today. How do we do that, and why is COP15 so important? I just very quickly want to look at the third challenge that I mentioned at the start, and that's the pandemic. The nature crisis and the global pandemic are very closely linked. COVID-19 reached us as a result of close contact between wild species and humans, and it's a direct outcome of today's nature crisis. If you look at almost all known pandemics, including HIV, AIDS, SARS, and COVID-19, they're all caused by microbes from animals. And the frequency of new diseases emerging in human population is now increasing, with the reservoir of currently undiscovered viruses thought to exist in mammals and birds at about 1.7 million, 48% of which could have the ability to infect humans. So clearly this is not going to go away. And even here in Scotland, studies have shown that since 2008, infection rate of Lyme's disease are rising across the UK, but particularly in Scotland. And scientists are saying it's highly likely the abundance of ticks in our outdoor environments is associated with the rise in deer numbers over the past 50 years. And that in turn may have contributed to the increasing incidence of Lyme disease. Just to put that into context, deer numbers across Scotland have doubled to almost 1 million now, from 500,000 in 1990. So that mirrors the rise in Lyme disease infections, and they are also causing huge damage to our uplands. So I just wanted to put that little bit of context in there as well. If we summarize all of that, we've got climate change with an unstable climate, living with extremes, and the spread of pandemics. We've got nature loss, broken ecosystems, species extinction, and habitat loss, and the start of pandemics. And then we also have something that I want to look at, which is a lack of political and public will. We sometimes think that we can solve it tomorrow, or someone else will do it, or we think we've got other more important things to do. And I will come back to that in a little bit. So we need to tackle climate and nature together. And that means that solutions for one mustn't make the other one worse. And there is potential for this. So for example, where we have biofuel production, it can replace food production or natural habitats. Or sometimes, quite often in Scotland, trees are planted in the wrong place. These are both potential solutions to climate change, but they make the nature crisis worse. And what's more, we've got other solutions, nature-based solutions that can tackle both. And just some examples of those could be nature-friendly farming, protecting marine habitats, natural regeneration of woodland, peatland restoration, better soil management. There's a whole host of nature-based solutions that tackle both crises. So I just want to do a very quick assessment really of where I think we are today. This is purely subjective, so others will disagree with me. But what I wanted to say is, so we've got an updated climate change action plan. That's good. We are making progress towards the 2045 climate targets. That's also good. When we come to nature loss, we're not moving fast enough. We missed the HE targets. These are biodiversity targets that were set in 2010. We missed them in 2010. We've missed them in 2020. We can't afford to miss them in 2030. The issue we have here, however, is that we don't have legally binding targets or commitment to that yet. And again, I'll come back to that because I think that's really important. In terms of public and political will, I think we do have public will. People are really keen to see transformative change. And I think we are seeing some rhetoric coming out of government, but The issue we have is that political will is driven by short-termism and is in constant danger of being derailed. And we only have to look at what's happening in the news now to see that the climate and nature crisis are no longer making the headlines. I don't know if you've read Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine, but if you haven't, I would read it. It was written in 2007, which is a long time ago, but it really clearly describes the way the world's operating today. So what's COP15? COP15 has been postponed twice. It was originally meant to happen in October 2020, then May to June 2021, and it looks as though it's probably going to happen now in October 2022. Although if you look at the website, it still says May. It takes place in Kunming in China. It officially opened in October 2021 when it adopted the Kunming Declaration, which has as its theme, ecological civilization, building a shared future for all life on Earth. Negotiations will happen later this year. There are a number of negotiations that has to happen before that, however, and there's some already happening. They're called Substa meetings, and there's some happening now, and then there'll be more in May, which is why we think the actual conference itself will probably now take place in October. What's its ambition? So it will see the adoption of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and this is a framework that provides a strategic vision and a global roadmap for the conservation, protection, restoration, and sustainable management of biodiversity and ecosystems over the next decade. It's got some ambitious targets, and it has the potential to be far-reaching if it's adopted. Draft 1 of the framework has been released. It was released in July 2021. It builds on lessons from the 2011 Strategic Plan for Biodiversity and the Aichi biodiversity targets that I've already talked about. And it recognises that urgent policy action is required globally, regionally, and nationally to transform economic, social, and financial models so that the trends that have exacerbated biodiversity loss will stabilise by 2030 and will enable its recovery by 2050. If I just give you a few of the key targets that are included in the framework, one is what's called the 30 by 30 target, which is to ensure that at least 30% globally of land area and sea area are conserved with protected areas and nature networks, and then fully integrated into landscapes and seascapes. Another one is to prevent or reduce the rate of the introduction and establishment of invasive alien species. Another one to reduce nutrients lost to the environment by at least half. And if I keep scrolling down, there's too many to read them all out to you, but another one around finances is to increase the financial resources from all sources, including new private financing, to enable biodiversity restoration to be invested in. So that's just some of the targets that the framework includes that, if implemented, as I say, could have a big impact. So what's Scotland's role at COP15? Scotland isn't a signatory to the Convention on Biological Diversity. It's the UK that's the signatory to the convention. But despite that, Scotland still has an important role because Scotland is taking the Edinburgh Declaration to COP15. And the Edinburgh Declaration is a call from sub-national governments, which is what the Scottish Government is, cities and local authorities, and it's calling on the CBD to take strong and bold actions to bring about transformative change, to recognise the vital role of sub-national governments, cities and local authorities, and to call for greater inclusion of sub-national governments, cities and local authorities. And that's really important because they have a really big role when it comes to conserving and restoring biodiversity. And in terms of what we're doing at home on COP15 issues, I've just got a few here that I'm just going to quickly run through. Adopting global nature targets, so the targets that come out of COP15, we want to see those adopted in Scotland. Designing and committing to a delivery plan to enable us to meet those targets by 2030. And part of this will be updating the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy and its own delivery plan. And then providing legislative underpinning to those nature targets through the Natural Environment Bill, which we expect to see coming through Parliament in 2023. Keeping pace with the EU Biodiversity Strategy and aligning relevant policies and plans. We've got an awful lot of policies and plans that are either going to help or hinder nature restoration, and we want to make sure that they're all aligned, that they go forwards, and they help build momentum towards our targets. So I'm just going to show you a short film. This is about the EU biodiversity strategy. So it's not about the Scottish one, but it gives you an idea of the sorts of things that we hope we will be seeing in Scotland as the biodiversity strategy gets updated. You'll notice, if you're paying attention, that the date on that was 2021, and that's because the COP15 has been delayed. So that film is still relevant, and we're still looking for those kind of outcomes to come out of COP15. Oh, there we go. So I'm going to speed up a little bit because I've already been talking for quite a long time. I just want to outline why COP15 is so important. And I think there's three areas where it's really important. One is the importance of targets, because targets really matter. We need to have something to aim for, and we need to have something to measure progress against. What that means, however, is that targets are hard because they give us, the ordinary people, a measure of progress so we can see when government or industry or individuals are not doing enough. But we can and we should be using targets to monitor progress and then point out when it falls short. Secondly, cooperation matters too. This is too big for government, too big for business, too big for society. We need to work together. So cooperation, ideally through the Edinburgh Declaration, gives us a platform to be able to work together. The reason the Edinburgh Declaration is so important is because it's estimated that 80% of biodiversity is in the care of subnational authorities, cities and local authorities. What they do and can do really does matter. And then the final point is that numbers matter. The more people talk about all of this, the louder is our voice for the environment, and the more likely we are to see the kind of transformative change that I've been talking about. There's a couple of barriers, though, that I just wanted to run past you. One is that we are suffering from what's called a shifting baseline or nature deficit disorder. They're not the same thing, but they amount to a barrier. The change in nature loss is largely incremental, which means as we lose things, we don't really notice, and we all start to suffer from a shifting baseline syndrome. The nature deficit disorder is where fewer children are coming into regular contact with nature and the outdoors across the UK. Even by the 1970s, which is when we started to collect decent data on nature trends, the changes had set in, and since then they've accelerated. So, for example, if you ask your parents, your grandparents, what they used to do when they were small, how many of them went fishing for sticklebacks or shrimps, for example, how many of them collected bunches of wildflowers or berries to make fruit jam or pies, and then compare that to how many children do that today. I think if you drew a graph of that, we'd see a pretty steep drop. The National Trust ran a survey in 2012 and found that fewer of a quarter of children regularly use their nature patch of nature nowadays, compared to over half of adults when they were children, and fewer than 1 in 10 regularly play in wild places, compared to almost half a generation ago. So you can see that there really is a change in the way we interact with nature and the way we experience nature. Then the other barrier really is what's called the Eisenhower principle. Climate change and nature loss are both important and urgent, but they suffer from what's called the Eisenhower principle. And we somehow need to turn them from urgent into important just to get them up the to-do list in Parliament. There's always something more urgent to do. There's a financial crash, a referendum, a global pandemic, a war. The irony of the pandemic, in fact, was that it was the direct result of the fact we've ignored the needs of our environment for too long, and it was starting to impact us directly. What we need to do, though, is make sure that the solutions to the urgent, they're just political reactions focused on the immediate, but they don't address ecological certainties, and we need to change that round. However, despite these being planetary emergencies, the solutions actually lie locally. There's a quote there from Margaret Atwood, the novelist, who puts it very eloquently. A parliamentary term of 5 years is too short, and there are too many dependencies and consequences for politicians to be able to act on a longer timescale. Today's nature and climate emergencies need to be solved in the next 10 years, but by the time politicians need to act in 10 years' time, it will be too late. But that's why change for these types of emergency, the demand for change for these types of emergencies come from grassroots communities, because they see well beyond the next 5 years. And this example I've given you here is from Ullapool Sea Savers, who ran a kelp campaign to prevent mechanical harvesting of kelp on the west coast of Scotland. And they had a great success in their campaign. So what does Scotland need to do in terms of COP15? COP15 is the linchpin, really, here in Scotland, that will help us work towards our national ambitions to lead the world, it's what we keep saying, on both climate and nature. And what we want to see is that commitment to targets, to global targets at COP15 that will provide the direction of travel for countries so that we can map our own journey towards meeting them. So what do we need to do then? I've got a few ideas here. We need nature targets. I know I keep banging on about this, but it's really important because we need to act now to recover nature, and we need to be able to measure progress. In 2019, the NGOs published the State of Nature Scotland report. And in that report, we showed that 1 in 9 of Scotland's species are in danger of extinction. 49% of Scottish species have decreased since the 1970s. So we can see that nature, even in Scotland, is changing rapidly, and 62% of species are showing strong changes. The drivers of that change in Scotland mirror exactly the drivers of change that I went through earlier on. So that, again, this is why COP15 and the IPBES report is being reflected in Scotland, and we need to do something about it here. Of this is that we need to protect our protected areas. Our SSSIs are often the refuge for many of our rare and the not so rare species, but it's from these refuges that they can spread when conditions are right, or when their habitat changes, sometimes they need to move. So protected areas need to be flexible enough to provide resilience in the habitats and amongst species populations. They need to be protected to prevent fragmentation, and they need to be properly protected, not just on paper, but also on land and at sea. Secondly, nature networks are really important. I was going to show you another little film clip here, but I'm running out of time, so I'll just put the link in the chat when we've finished. But nature networks are really important because they link up habitats, and they also link up ecological processes. And one thing that we and our members are calling for is nature networks as a key part of the National Planning Framework 4. I won't say any more about that, but I will put the link to the film in the chat so you can watch it later at your leisure. The second thing we need to do is to look at a circular economy. We need a circular economy because that helps us reduce our impact on ecosystems. What that means is living within our planetary limits. It means reuse and reduce demand for raw materials and recycle as a last resort. The graphic that I've shown you there is from a campaign that we're running called Circular Economy, and there's lots more information there about what a circular economy is and why we need it and how it helps us restore our ecosystems and protect them for future generations. I mentioned policy alignments very briefly earlier on. Because we're in a crisis and we are under some time pressure, we need to turn this around within the next 10 years. We can't afford for policies to act against each other. They all need to be pulling in the same direction and be coordinated. So, for example, over the next 5 years in the Scottish Parliament, we're expecting to see a whole raft of policies come through, and we need them all to be pointing in the same way. So this will include, for example, the National Planning Framework 4, the Forestry Strategy, a Biodiversity Strategy, Natural Environment Bill, regional land use partnerships, and whatever we decide to do with agricultural subsidies going forward. They all need to be contributing to the restoration of nature, and COP15 and the legally binding targets will help us do that. I've mentioned agricultural subsidies very briefly, and I also mentioned redirecting finance earlier on when I was talking about the IPBES report and its recommendations. Agricultural subsidies is a piece of work in progress, and what we're asking for within LINC is we want to see a transformation in how subsidies are distributed away from the current system and instead towards one where we pay farmers and crofters to deliver public goods, which we define as restoring soils, restoring nature, and producing sustainable local food. The Cabinet Secretary did announce a welcome strategy and vision last week, it was, about sustainable and regenerative agriculture. It's very high level, so there's no detail in it, but it is a good vision for us to be aiming towards as long as we stick to it. One other thing is that we need to be looking at increasing finance from other sources other than government. Government can't do this on its own. And we need to be looking at markets that are no longer blind to pollution and nature destruction, but which price it in and preferably avoid it completely. The final point that is really important but often gets a bit forgotten is ensuring everyone has access to a healthy environment so they can help, so they're in contact with nature and they can make their voice heard. As I said, the more people talking about this, the better. So for example, some ways that would help that is 20-minute neighbourhoods where everyone living in Scotland has access to a healthy green space. By that I mean it's ecologically functional, that's within 20 minutes active travel from their home, whether that's by walking or by bike. We need the infrastructure in place in order to support that, so you can walk and bike from your home to a healthy green space. And we also need to build confidence and skills so that everyone in Scotland can access the outdoors. All of this to work though, our politicians need to be empowered to act against vested interests. We've seen a few things come through the news very, very recently about how the global crisis is already driving short-termism in the call to reverse UK fracking, and then in the call about environmental standards in farming. We were really pleased that the Cabinet Secretary yesterday committed to sustainability in farming in Parliament. So we want to see that the focus on nature restoration being held in politicians' minds. But that's exactly where COP15 can help. It highlights the urgent planetary needs that need to be addressed, and it gives the reason and momentum to build transformation towards a healthier planet, not one where we continue to take what we need, but without giving anything back. Just a few last slides. What are we and our members going to be doing at COP15? During COP26, we shared a whole host of insights on COP26 through a blog series, and we'll be doing the same with COP15. And we also work with MSP nature champions. And the point of this campaign is that MSPs can learn about nature. They learn about nature in their own communities and more widely, and then they are much more vocal in Scotland, in Parliament, when it comes to talking about restoration and protection of nature. So we're hoping that they will be primed and ready to be talking up for nature when we're discussing the Natural Environment Bill, for example, when it comes through Parliament. Parliament can also do a lot through legislation to protect, enhance, and to build in and guide and enforce changes. And in the last Parliament, this is just some of the things, some of the successes that the Cabinet Secretary Rosanna Cunningham had in terms of marine issues. There's a lot more to do, and we want to see this kind of list for all of the Cabinet Secretaries in the next Parliament as we go forward looking at the nature and climate crisis. One of the most important things is to talk about this, and the importance of talking to others and spreading the word can't be overstated. This, in fact, is the Ullapool Sea Savers, who I mentioned earlier. They're a brilliant example of a local group of young people working together, highlighting local and global issues, and then bringing others on board by either inspiring them and sometimes shaming them into act. So they're brilliant. I would look them up and see what they're doing. LINC has got a few other campaigns. One is called Fight for Scotland's Nature, and which will be focused on calling Parliament to adopt legally binding targets for nature, and that will be linked to COP15. And then we're also looking at another new campaign on agricultural subsidies launching soon, so do keep your eyes peeled for those. Finally, I just wanted to end with some of the inspiring stories that really keep me going and keep me plugging away, even when progress seems a long way off. COP15 is the next chance we have to get to to talk about nature really. And I just wanted to show you some of these pictures so you could see what sort of thing really we need to be talking about and why COP15 is going to be so important, not just to us in Scotland, but also globally. That's me. You can find out more about what we do through the links there. And there's also more films and things. And I make sure I put the link to those films in the chat so you can look at those. And that's me.
Thank you very much, Deborah. An absolute masterclass in everything COP15 and particularly in what Scotland and indeed every single one of us can do about it and be aware about. Fiona put up a little message there. Am I still online? Yeah.
Yes, you are, James. Yeah.
Yeah, for some reason my screen went peculiar. Yeah, Fiona put up a message there. Please, if you've got questions or comments, just put them in the chat box, and I'll certainly do my best, and Fiona will be helping me to pick out any questions and comments. And I see there's some hands going up as well, so that's an alternative, and I'll come to those. Deborah, can I put a couple of questions to you first? I should declare an interest because I'm proud to be an honorary fellow of Scottish Environment Link. So I know that Deborah and her colleagues and all 44, I got it wrong, 44 now NGOs are working across the huge spectrum to try and get nature back in a better position. And those final pictures you showed were beautiful and very moving. And I remember once being on a holiday in the Norfolk Broads, and we parked the boat overnight, and I was just wandering along the towpath, and I came across a huge wooden fence right across the towpath. And I thought, what on earth is that? And there was a tiny little spy hole through the fence, and you look through. I'm getting quite emotional even remembering it now. You look through that spy hole and you looked into a totally different world, because that was a totally protected zone on the Norfolk Broads. And the range of plants and animals, the biodiversity, it was burgeoning just beyond that wooden fence, looking through that spy hole compared to the area where I was walking along the towpath. And it brought home to me so graphically that we live, all of us, I think, generally, in such a degraded environment. Do we honestly know anymore what the world should look like and how the world should be functioning? And is that a problem, do you think? A problem to every one of us and to our mental health and our physical activity also. But is it a problem in undermining what the likes of COP15 and Link is trying to do? Because we've just lost contact with what nature should really be.
I think it is a potential problem, James. It's part of this nature deficit disorder that I was talking about, in that we become accustomed to a depleted environment, species, diversity-wise, and we think that's normal. So then as we go through, we think we're restoring to a deficit type of environment, which is dangerous, because an environment that's depleted of species and habitats diversity is not resilient to change. And we know we've got a lot of changes coming down the line with climate and other changes. So we need to have in our heads that we want to restore back to a diverse type of ecosystems, even if we haven't actually ever experienced that ourselves. I think having that window into other worlds is really important, and that helps us remember and think about where we're heading. One very current conversation amongst our members and amongst the environmental sector in general is when we talk about restoring, what are we talking about restoring to? We're not actually talking about restoring to, primeval Caledonian pine woodland, for example. What we're talking about restoring to is much, much more pragmatic than that. We're talking about restoring to a diverse ecosystem that's fully ecologically functional. It doesn't matter if it doesn't have all of the species that the Caledonian pine would have had, as long as it's got a diversity of species so that the niches are filled and it can perform the ecosystem services that we need to do. That's a very live discussion and people will disagree with me on that. But in my head, as a paleoecologist, that's what we're aiming for. But that's why the contact with nature is so important, so that we can appreciate that diversity is good in all walks of life, actually, not just nature.
Okay, thanks for that. There's a couple of hands up, and I know I'm going to get your name wrong, so apologies before I even try. But you were first up, Shaste. Is that right?
Yes. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for having me today. It was very good sessions because I'm doing my PhD, but I'm doing in hospitality, and my thesis is focusing in the sustainability in the hotel line. Because we all know that the hotels industry, especially spa centers, hospitalities division, those things are very bad effect to the environment if they don't follow those environmental friendly SOP that now is on place. So since I'm very new in Glasgow, but I did this research before for my master in Malaysia, and all my funding now is implementing it from the Ministry of Tourism to all hoteliers. So I want to know that how can I join to any society that for the hotels in the green, from the green perspective, or from the Scottish government for the environmental friendly practices, that I can share my knowledge, my founding, and then even though I know, get some feedback from the industry role player, because I believe that my research cannot have only help for the academic side. The most important is the industry, that I want that they benefit from my funding. So I just wanted to know that, because as I just mentioned, that tourism, traveling is the one that is very, very important, but has an effect to the environmental issues as well. Just wanted to know that how can I participate, or how can I join those societies or related matters. I really appreciate if you guide me.
Yeah, good question, and a very relevant one. And I wonder if I can ask Deborah, obviously, for an answer to that, but maybe open it up a bit, because you talked about the need to get finance into it. This is a huge project to recover biodiversity. So how do we get the help, the private sector generally, in behind it, putting everything for those various sectors like the tourism sector, but other sectors as well, behind it to really drive it forward with the scale and mobilization that's required?
Shall I come in there, James? There are a number of thoughts that I had as you were asking there. One obvious one is if you go onto our website, you'll be able to see all of our members, and if you click on the member page, then you'll be able to see you will then go directly to their pages. So from the question that you asked, there are a number of organisations that I would suggest you look at. There's the obvious nature-based organisations like the RSPB and the Woodland Trust, for example. There's a whole host of those sorts of organisations. The other organisation that you might be particularly interested in, however, is Keep Scotland Beautiful, which have an initiative called Green Key, and that's all about sustainability in the hotel sector. I'll put the link to that in the chat so you can go directly to the right page, but that was just one thing that I thought about. The other thing that your question made me think about are the wildlife operators that operate across Scotland. There's particularly a lot in the Cairngorms, but there's I can't remember exactly what they're called, but I'll look it up. James might know actually. Wildlife operators who are based in a local area, work with hotels, and then do things like tours and talks and that kind of thing. So they bring hotel visitors into direct contact with local nature. And as I say, that's a really good way of getting people to see what's out there, to appreciate and to kind of get in touch with nature, and then be a bit of a voice for the environment.
Brilliant.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Can I go back to the slightly wider question, because well, I have an interest here because we've both been looking at how to get private finance into big scale dynamic nature recovery. Do you have any thoughts about that? Because the feeling, and I think this is becoming quite widespread now, is that public funding and philanthropic funding are just not going to be enough for the scale of this challenge.
Yeah, sorry, James, I ignored that question. So yes, you're absolutely right that the scale of the challenge is too big for even government on its own. And there's a lot of very current conversations at the moment in our sector about the fact that many of our members, for example, have a whole host of projects that are really important and initiatives that are really important in order to conserve and restore habitats and species, but they struggle to find the funding for it. And then at the same time, there's the finance sector, which has a lot of money that it wants to spend on sustainability and sustainable projects, but there is a mismatch at the moment between what environmental projects need doing on the ground and what businesses are able to invest in. So what we're trying to do is hold a conversation so that we at least understand what environmental organisations need to be delivering on the ground in order to conserve nature, and what financial investment organisations, for example, are able to invest in, because at the moment it feels as though we're talking, you know, Egyptian and Greek or something, and the conversations just aren't being understood. So that's happening. The other thing I would say is that there is a role, a really important role for public funding, in that sometimes some of the stuff we need to do to restore nature isn't actually going to be it's not going to be investable according to investment and finance organisations, because all it will do is conserve a particular habitat. Montane scrub, for example, is a really, really important habitat, but it's government that needs to invest in that to address the barrier really that we have at the moment, because we have so little left, that will then, we hope, open the door for financial, for much wider financial private businesses to come in. So there's a really important role there for public funding and charitable funding to be able to put their money into what might be termed Cinderella habitats and species, which are really, really important, but aren't the peatlands and the woodlands, which is where private financing is going at the moment.
Thank you, Deborah. Fiona said her cat might make a guest appearance, and I did see its tail in the picture there, but seems to be out of shot at the moment. Jack, you've had your hand up for quite a while, so apologies for that, but over to you.
No, that's absolutely fine. Can you hear me okay? Great. Hi, Deborah, that was a really great presentation. I came across this just a couple of days ago by surprise, so it's been nice to just stumble across that and hear a really interesting presentation. I guess my biggest question, it stems from my volunteer work with an initiative at the moment. I wonder really, how do initiatives get involved with COP15? You mentioned a lot of really interesting ones that are happening in Scotland. So it would be interesting to know how other initiatives go about getting involved in different ways. The one I'm working with at the moment, I'm a UK youth engagement coordinator, especially in Scotland, with an initiative called Save Soil, which is trying to be a global campaign. It's run by a fella called Sadhguru, who's got a huge international reach, and he's campaigning across from Europe to southern India starting next week actually. doing various different events, and they've put together 126 MOUs, and they've just got partnered up with 5 Caribbean islands actually on agreeing with moving towards sustainable health within agricultural soil. So me being a part of this in the UK team, really want to get this out as much as I can to different youth teams and engagement with universities across Scotland. So that's been a big reason for me to come today and try and listen to you and see what can be done for initiatives like this to get on board with COP15's activities.
That's a really good question, and it really comes back to the fact that if you look at COP26 and what happened at COP26, the energy was all outside of the room. It was on the streets, and it was people calling for very ambitious targets, and I think that had such an impact because it meant that it gave the decision makers and the policy makers inside the space to be able to really push back against vested interests. And although they didn't get as far as we would have wanted them, without that public call outside, not just physically, but also online, I don't think we would have seen the sorts of decisions that came out of COP26, even though they didn't go far enough. They went further than they would have done, I think. So it's really important that we try and create that same pressure and public awareness around COP15. Obviously, that's going to be harder because it's in Kunming. It's a long, long way away. And the Scottish government will only be there because of the Edinburgh Declaration. But the one thing we need to do is to create the public space between all of us for politicians to be able to act and to do the things they need to do. And some of it is actually very controversial. So the one that's in my head at the moment, because it's happening now, is what's happening with agricultural subsidies. We really, really need to change the system that we've got at the moment, because we're not investing in nature and climate solutions for the future. If we stick with the old model, we're just going to keep going down the path of nature loss and carbon release. So, but the issue we have really is that there is a very strong vested interest and lobbying that's talking to politicians on a daily basis, and that we need to keep counteracting. And the more that people are talking about it publicly, particularly young people, it means that politicians are really saying that there's a public call for transformative and radical change, and that they then have the space to act. So anything you can do to keep it, at the top of politicians' social media feeds, at the top of their awareness, so that they feel that they have the confidence to be able to make what will be unpopular decisions, just makes it all much, much more likely that we'll see the sorts of changes that we need to see, because they are going to have to make some really tough decisions. But we need them to go in our favour, in the environment's favour.
That's amazing. Okay. Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you for that. I guess then my immediate response would be just to plug this initiative and try and get people looking at it. If anyone's interested, it's savesoil.org. So yeah, we're trying to get as much awareness across the UK at the moment about soil degradation based on the UNCCD's predictions of soil degradation across the next 50 years. So yeah, definitely check it out if anyone's interested in that, because we're doing exactly that at the moment. We're trying to raise awareness and get youth engaged as much as possible in different ways. So yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. Cheers for that answer.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jack. And I know Deborah and also myself have done quite a bit on soils over the years. So no need to persuade us of the absolutely vital importance to planetary health of good soils. Again, an environmental compartment that is probably ignored and dangerously so. There's an interesting chat comment from Abdullah, and what particularly intrigues me, I don't know if Abdullah wants to join in the conversation. I'm very welcome to if you'd like to, but he's a business analyst, which is fantastic. Great to see business analysts joining us. And he's making the point that individuals need to understand their own impacts on the environment and damage to ecosystems. But as a business analyst, he feels he should be promoting environmentally friendly solutions to his clients, or his future clients anyway, and have follow-up parameters to monitor those recommendations. A really important point. And I just did, we don't have a lot of time, but we could go on for hours, I think. I did want to follow up anyway with Deborah on the circular economy, which I know Environment Link is doing a huge amount. Business analysts should be right in there promoting the circular economy, because it flashed past us on one of your slides, Deborah. But a figure I often quote is that 90% of biodiversity decline is driven by extraction of raw materials and downstream processing. I mean, that is massive damage to biodiversity from the way we run our economy. Deborah, I know Link is working hard on the circular economy.
And this is one, you know, I was talking about the Eisenhower principle earlier on, and the fact that we and politicians just get distracted by stuff that's happening. This is exactly what happened to the circular economy bill. So we were expecting to see it last year, and then it just got bumped by the pandemic and all of what happened around that. There was an announcement, it was either yesterday or the day before, that they are going to start to introduce the circular economy bill into the next parliamentary session. So that's really good. We'll be pushing to make sure that they actually do that and don't get derailed by whatever else comes down the line. And as a very specific example of a piece of legislation that would actually make a big difference to a circular economy, particularly from a business and consumer perspective, is the deposit return scheme that many of our members have been working on for a long time. And this is to encourage and enable us and businesses to return drinks packages, particularly, so that they don't just end up in the environment and ultimately in the ocean. All of the legislation for that is in place, but it hasn't been enacted yet. And it just keeps getting bumped because other things keep happening. So that's another example of where a circular economy and the specific actions are really, really important, but they just keep getting bumped by other things. So the more we can demonstrate that there is a call for this kind of action, the better. There's a specific campaign that's running at the moment about wet wipes that's being run by Scottish Water and the Marine Conservation Society, one of our members. And there, obviously that's a business, a public agency business, and environmental NGO and individuals calling for governments to ban wet wipes, which again would be a big, well, it sounds small, but it would actually make a big difference to the amount of plastic that goes into the environment, and it's a key part of a circular economy. So there's a few things there that we really need to make sure that we keep our noses to the grindstone on it, really, so that they do actually get through Parliament and we start to see legislation come through.
Okay, thanks, Deborah. We're getting very close to the end. 1 or 2 minutes just, but so Natalie has her hand up. So can you be very brief, Natalie?
I'll be so quick. I was really just going to respond to Abdullah. I'm in the business school as well. I've just finished a study where we looked at circular economy and we looked at incentivization. And really what came out was firstly that businesses, particularly SMEs, who we found that we need to lead the uptake of circular economy, they're scared of the term circular economy. And if you break it down into these smaller circular strategies, actually they're already doing some of them. And the reason that they're doing them is for tangible benefits. And I think, which Deborah, I think you touched on earlier, you know, biodiversity isn't the same buzzword as zero waste yet, or as clean energy. So I think it's about bringing that competitive appeal or the business appeal to biodiversity. And in our findings, certainly that didn't come across. It still was very much about zero waste, which does feed into biodiversity, but it perhaps just isn't the driver for many of the firms that are already invested in circular operations.
That's a really interesting comment, Matty, and a challenge yet again to all of us, and I'm sure to Deborah. Listen, and in fact, I was involved in a couple of sandpits that the Centre for Sustainable Development at the university ran over the last few weeks, bringing together researchers in the circular economy from right across the university. So hopefully something will develop out of those sandpits to unite and drive greater partnership and collaboration across the university, and maybe even across other universities as well, to take the circular economy forward through some sort of knowledge hub. Let's wait and see. But anyway, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to ask Deborah just to give her a few seconds warning for some final motivational remarks to point out on. And then if Deborah, you could pass across to Fiona to close the meeting. But from me, it's been a real pleasure to be here and to hear Deborah and to hear the comments and questions. Thank you everybody for joining in. So Deborah.
I just wanted to very briefly say that Natalie, I think you've raised a really important point there, that language is so important. I mean, I can remember years ago that we were even talking about whether we should be using the word biodiversity, and we do use it and it is getting picked up, but we talk about nature much more because that's what people link into. So wherever we are, we need to be using the language and the hooks that our audience are interested in. And you're right, from a business perspective, zero waste is much more of a hook than biodiversity and ecosystem restoration might be. Although obviously we're hoping that COP15 will turn that around. I suppose the main point that I wanted to make really is that there's stuff we can all do. You know, it's not down just to government, it's not down just to NGOs, it's down to all of us really. And the biggest thing we can all do is really demonstrate the call for the transformative change that we need to make if we are to enable future generations to experience what we experience at the moment, because the downward trend at the moment isn't great. So let's just do everything we can to make as much noise as we can about the environment and how important it is. And I think that is the best legacy we could all possibly have. Back to you, Fiona.
That was great. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, James, as well for chairing. But I think you'll all come with me to thank Deborah very much for coming, and what was such an informative talk. I didn't know anything about COP15 before we organised this event, so I'm definitely much wiser from it. And thank you everybody for attending as well and getting interactive as well. I think that helps get the most out of these kind of sessions. I put a couple of links in the chat. It's just to find out about more events that we're having for our Sustainability Month throughout March. But and I think somebody mentioned about, you know, having this as a one-off meeting. I would like to see more meetings like this, bringing different minds together to think about things that are happening all over the world really, and how it can affect us here in Scotland. So thank you again to James coming today, and thank you again to Deborah, and also thank you to all of you for coming, and we hope to see you again soon.